So, it sounds like we are good to go, folks. We're just going to launch right in. I'll pray and we'll launch right in and see where the Lord takes us in an hour together, okay? Let's pray. Father, we do thank you so much for the opportunity to gather. Thank you for this beautiful evening as it's cooled down now here in our area, in the Houston area here. Thank you for the new season. Continue to guide and direct us. Guide and direct all that's going on through the ministries of the church here. Provide for every need, both corporately and individually, for everyone who's a part. Thank you, Lord, for the privilege that we have of being your children and a part of your eternal plan. And I just pray that you would make yourself known to us tonight in your presence and your greatness through all that we say together. This we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Well, tonight is a great privilege for me because I get to share with you a lot of the original research that I've done in the last, let's say 7 years within that time. Part of it has gone into, well, actually, especially what I'll be talking about next Tuesday has gone into my first book that's already published. And there's a book I'm working on now that should have been done by now. The publisher is just on my tail. But all of that relates to what I'm going to be talking about tonight. So, to be honest, I could probably talk about this maybe 8 hours, something like that, roughly. So imagine condensing all of that into 1 hour. That's the challenge that we face tonight. So unless I do lock the doors tonight and require you to stick it out, we're going to do that very thing. We're going to look at a condensed version, some of the real highlights of all of this. And it goes back to, I think I mentioned when we met on Tuesday night, that there's this dearth out there, and that's what got me in this field. This dearth in as far as those who have committed and devoted their lives to the study of biblical history in such a way that you try to get a very strong grasp on the history that's recorded in the Bible, and you also try to study the lands of the ancient world and the ancient Near East that will connect you to that history that's recorded in the Bible. And because of that, we're in a very difficult spot, we being Christianity, Christendom. And that difficult spot is that most of the authority figures who are speaking in reference to ancient Near Eastern history are those who have let's just say, a worldview that requires them to have a view that's strongly antithetical to the history that's recorded in the Bible and to the integrity of the Bible, to what we refer to as the inerrancy of the Bible, that there's no error contained in the original manuscripts. They fight against anything related to that. And I know this for certain because I spent, from 2008 to 2016 at the University of Toronto. And I experienced this firsthand. So it's not a myth. It's not something far away. For me, it's something very real. It's something I saw every single day and experienced on campus. And this has impacted biblical studies. And it's caused pastors and Bible college teachers and professors, in many cases, if not most cases, to step back, to step away from ancient Near Eastern history because, in a sense, the market is more or less cornered by those who have a very different view and have a very strong agenda that they want to accomplish. So, as I mentioned to you on Tuesday, I would love to see God continue to raise up more harvesters because the field is white for harvest in this area. There's a lot more that can be done. There are a lot more contributions waiting out there for people to fulfill, to make and fulfill. So I take this all very seriously, and at the heart of this all were several criticisms that were leveled against biblical history, the Bible's version of history, and these are very strong criticisms, very seeking to humiliate. Essentially, I can't think of the word I want, but that being the case, one of them, in fact, okay, I'll go to the second one first that we're not going to be talking about tonight. I've written an article about a site called Kirbet Kayapha, which is the site where the Israelites would have been encamped right at the time of the battle between David and Goliath, which was followed up by the Israelites routing the Philistines all the way westward to their home cities and killing them along the road. All of that took place with the Israelites before the battle between David and Goliath. The Israelites were within the confines of the walls of Kirbet Kayapha, an ancient site. And that's one of the sites that essentially argues that we have, that at the time of King Saul, King David, King Solomon, we had a strong central authority, we had a powerful state that that had an administrative system that was run from a capital city, the capital city of Jerusalem. And so in the last 15, 20 years, there's been an enormous amount of evidence that's come forth for all of this, that's supporting all of this. But essentially, it acts as a, I don't know if deterrence is the right word, but a response to this major criticism. And the criticism has been, before this came, this evidence started to come along, the criticism was, we have no evidence of a united monarchy that the Bible talks about, where Saul and David and Solomon could have reigned. The Bible speaks of their control of all of this area and their free movement, and if all of this was truly taking place, or did take place, then there should be proof that's left behind in the archaeological record that we can show that would expose this as true. Well, that criticism was fine and dandy until all the evidence started to pour in. Now, it's a completely different day with this criticism. Well, that's pretty much what I would consider the second major criticism that's been leveled by university professors and so forth along these lines. The most major one is, the Bible says that the Israelites were in Egypt for 430 years. If this is true, then there should be some kind of evidence that the Israelites were there. But the fact is, there isn't any evidence for it, and therefore, how can we trust the Bible's historical accounts? And of course, the inference is, if you can't trust the historical accounts, how can you trust the spiritual message that's in the book? Well, this criticism is the one that essentially, until very recently, there has been no evidence. There has been no evidence that directly ties to confounding this criticism. And oddly enough, of all people, God chose me to be the one that He would drop into this, I refer to it as a gold mine of evidence. And that being the case, the responsibility fell on my shoulders to research thoroughly. In fact, it's ironic because at the time that God dropped me into all this, it was 2012, and I was studying for my comprehensive exams for my PhD, and somehow I squeaked by in my comprehensive exams, but I was spending every spare minute I should have been preparing for the exams, instead doing research along these lines. In this, with this evidence that God kept just dropping, like manna from the sky, over and over. And the writing of my dissertation after my comprehensive exams was delayed because I was spending all of this time in the research. And included in that, in fact, it culminated at the very end. I wrote a couple chapters in the book that I'm finishing now. And I wrote the entire book, what started to be the second book but ended up being the first book. I wrote all of that and finished it once I had defended my dissertation and I was just waiting for graduation. So now that all of this evidence is out there, it falls to me to put it out there for the world to see. And that's where these books come in handy. And so that's what we're going to talk about tonight, especially going back to the lifetime of Joseph. So pretty much all that we're going to talk about tonight relates to events that occurred while Joseph was alive in Egypt, both during the time that he served in administrative capacities and when he undoubtedly would have been retired from that. And of course, he ended up living a fairly long life in comparison to how long people live today. 110 years or so, I think it is. So we're going to look at that tonight, see how far we get. And the one caveat I have to give you is most of you probably are not history majors. And we do have one. But is your area of expertise in history in the ancient Near Eastern world? Yeah. Okay. So everybody in that sense is on the same page that I'm taking you into a world you've probably rarely been in, if ever, or only to a small extent. So I understand that, and I'm going to do my best to keep you along with me as I go, as I take you, so I don't lose you on the way. And at the same time, no matter how well I do at that, it's going to be a challenge because this is so new for you. And unless you've studied Egyptology, it's going to be, your mind is going to be a little bit throbbing maybe, or a little bit sore at the end of the night. But I'm a believer in no pain, no gain. So we're going to suffer together. How's that? All right, so with that caveat, let's launch. So first essentially we're going to take a chronological, more or less, a chronological survey through this. Logically, it would be best to start a little bit later, but I'm going to start you with the time that Joseph and Jacob were at the site of Αβάρις. Okay, first let's look at a biblical text and a site plan that's going to help orient us to this. So where are we in the genealogical tree? Well, of course, you know that Abram, who became Abraham, is the father of a multiplicity of nations, one of which being the Israelites. And his son of promise was Isaac, who was born in Negev. So Abraham was born in Ur in Mesopotamia. That's by the Persian Gulf. His son Isaac is born in the Negev. That means south in Hebrew. It's in Canaan, southern Canaan. That's where Isaac was born. His son of promise, of course, not that he chose it this way, but it was manipulated by his son himself. He stole the birthright from his older brother, and that, of course, is Jacob, who became Israel. He was born in Canaan as well. And what I'm going to try to persuade you of tonight, among other things, is that Jacob's son, who essentially became the one who inherited the birthright, I don't know if the Bible even ever mentions or explicitly states that Joseph received the birthright. But of course, it does explicitly state that it went to his sons Ephraim and Manasseh. So, and his second-born son Ephraim, he received the greater part of the blessing, which Jacob is the one who bestowed to him, not Joseph. So those two sons are here on the left and right, the bottom of the screen. Manasseh, or we know of him in English as Manasseh, and Ephraim, which we would call Ephraim. Those are the two oldest sons. And they were born undoubtedly, in my own mind, I can't prove this beyond a shadow of a doubt, but born in the city of Lahun, where Joseph would have settled first, not when he first arrived in Egypt, but when he was elevated to the position of second in command in all of Egypt. That's where he would have moved. No doubt about it at all. We won't really go into that part of the story because remember I told you this is roughly 8 hours worth. That fits in the other 7 hours. Okay? So we can't cover that. All right. There's a text that again orients us to all of this. It's found in Genesis 47:11. It says this, and this is my translation. Everywhere you see English translation from the Bible, it's my translation. Now Joseph settled his father and his brothers, and he gave them property in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land, and here it is in yellow, in the land of Ramesses, in the land of Ramses, just as that which Pharaoh had commanded. Now, there's a problem with this. First of all, I don't know if you know the controversy or not, but there's a controversy as to when exactly the Exodus happened. And there are 3 major views that I consider major views out there. There are some minor views that aren't really held by that many people. The two most major of the 3 major views are the early Exodus view and the late Exodus view. If you hold to the early Exodus view that I hold to, you are convinced that the Exodus occurred in 1446 BC. If you hold to the late Exodus view, you say, no, the Exodus happened sometime in the 13th century BC, the 1200s BC. Okay, so there's that problem of this disagreement. And it's a very complex issue, and I could spend all night just on that topic alone, but I won't. Well, an Egyptian king, a pharaoh named Ramses II, who ruled from, according to my chronology, 1290 to 1223 BC, he built the site of Per-Ramesses, and that means house of Ramses. So it's his house. He built the city that he called his house. So he built Per-Ramesses as his capital. So, does this require a 13th century Exodus date? So here's the problem for those who, such as I, who hold to the early Exodus view that says the Exodus occurred in 1446 BC. Well, if that's true, then why in Genesis 47:11 does the Bible refer to this site as Ramses when it doesn't become known as the site of Ramses until the 13th century? So that very fact is the main, if not only, argument that the late Exodus date supporters use to support their view. And certainly it fits a lot easier for them if you just look at this text in a cursory reading and that's it. So essentially I have to be able to answer the criticism, why are you saying that the Exodus occurred in the 15th century BC when Ramses wasn't Ramses until the 13th century BC? So before we go anywhere, we have to solve that problem. Well, if you look at the world's most trustworthy source that you can find anywhere, which of course is known as Wikipedia, you will see an entry for the site of Kantir. Kantir is the Arabic name for Ramses, right? We just read that in Genesis 47:11, right? In the land of Ramses, right? That city, that site, in the ancient world is Ramses. In the modern world, it's Kantir. Okay? So, under the entry for Kantir, and you can look this up today. Maybe it's been changed since I made this slide. I don't know. But it says Kantir is a modern village in Egypt. It's believed to mark what was probably the ancient site of the 19th dynasty, Pharaoh Ramses II's great capital. And I would say it's way more than probably. It's certain. I don't know of one reputable Egyptologist who dissents or disagrees with this. And of course, it's called P-Ramesses or Per-Ramesses, the house of Ramses or his domain. And then there's this part in the red box that says this. I don't know if you can read it from where you are now, so I'll just read it for you. It says, the ancient site of Avaris is located around 2 kilometers south of Kantir. And really, that's non-exact. It's southwest of Kantir. But it's, roughly 2 kilometers away. This was the older city in the area, meaning Avaris was the older city, Per-Ramesses was the newer city. Later, and here's the key right here that makes Wikipedia so trustworthy. Later on, Avaris was absorbed by P-Ramesses. Well, you know what? That's exactly right. It's exactly right. So when Ramses II came along and said, I'm going to establish my own little beachhead, my city here at this mound known as Kantir, it was basically adjacent to the old abandoned city of Avaris. So when he moved his capital there and built up the city, built it into a great city, the rest of the old city of Avaris was absorbed into Per-Ramesses. So it's all one site. Does that make sense? The newer in Ramesses II's day absorbed the older city, abandoned city that was to its southwest. And I can prove this now, that this is not just a modern conception, but it's what the ancients actually thought. And that's really important. Okay, so here's how we'll start. We'll look at this map, and you probably can't see it from where you are, but there's a beautiful little red dot right there in the eastern Nile Delta. So all of this is northeastern Africa, known today as Egypt. And of course, the Nile River here, which flows to the north. It's one of the rare northward flowing cities in the northern hemisphere. And then, of course, Sinai is this little wedge here, the Gulf of Suez here. And then Canaan is up in this area. And I've got a word here in big letters, big black letters, called retinue. And that's to remind myself to tell you what is retinue. So the Egyptians, they of course were different than the Asiatics, including the people who lived in retinue. Those are called Asiatics, believe it or not. That's a part of ancient Asia. They looked at these people as foreigners, and they gave them a name. They named them retinue. Right? It's like when I lived in Russia, if I was talking to a Russian person and I was talking about someone who lives in the city of Moscow, I would call that person a Moskvich, someone who lives in Moscow. But so the people, all the people living in Moscow are Moskvichi. But when I come back to America and talk to you about the people who live in the city of Moscow, I don't use that word because you don't know that word from Adam, right? But the word you do know, assuming you know it, is Muscovites. That's how we would call people who live in Moscow in English. So as the Egyptians are talking to themselves about the people who live up in that area, they're not using the local name that the people had. They're using their own version of it, and their version of it, how they pronounce it for those people up in Canaan, they're retinue. Okay? So, remember that. So that's where our site is, Avaris, where all of this action is happening. And again, what I'm going to be trying to prove to you, if you didn't gather this by now, maybe I could have said it already, is that the site where Jacob and his family settled when they moved to Egypt is this very site of Avaris, just to the southwest of Kantir, of ancient Per-Ramesses, the house of Ramses. So, let me now prove it to you. Well, here's basically, coming straight from the horse's mouth, there was an inscription found on a shrine door dating to the 20th Egyptian dynasty. The 1200s, the time of the initial Ramesside kings, that's the 19th dynasty. So this is one dynasty later. That's all, between 1196 and 1069 BC. So this inscription on the shrine door that's now in the Pushkin Museum, and of course that's in Russia, mentions a certain Wab priest. A Wab priest is a certain kind of ancient Egyptian priest of the god Amun. So basically, your average priest serves a specific Egyptian deity or god, and this priest served Amun, one of the gods associated with the sun, who was located at the harbor of Avaris. So the priest was located at the harbor of Avaris. So picture it this way. He's in the Ramesside city. He's not in Avaris, but he's in the Ramesside city, and he works for the temple of Amun there, and he goes down to the shoreline, and there is the harbor, and he refers to himself, and he says, "Here I am at the harbor of Avaris." Now, if you're an Egyptologist, you hear this and you know all these facts, right? You hear him say this and you say, no, you're not in the harbor of Avaris. You're in the harbor of Paramesses. That's where you are. Well, the ancient priest is smarter than we are. That's the bottom line. He knew where he was, and the reason he called himself, he spoke of himself as being at the harbor of Avaris, is because Avaris was incorporated into ancient Paramesses. So he should have said what we would expect as Paramesses, but he said, no, I'm at Avaris. And here this is on a map so that you can see it. In the upper right, this is the area of Kantir, ancient Paramesses. And it's been excavated in all these areas, and lots of architecture has been found and important artifacts, etc. Here's the town center of the 19th dynasty, so that's at its height, in its heyday, when Ramses II was around. And you see this area right here, this little bulge? This is where the harbor is, because the waters of the Nile that have already been dispersing as you get into the Nile Delta, right? It moves along to the north here. This is called the Pelusiac branch of the Nile. And it works its way around all of these. They're called turtlebacks. All of these are turtlebacks. And it makes its way on all the way into the Mediterranean Sea. And so as the water's making its way here, of course, being that this is a port city, you need to have a port. No port, no port city. That's how it works. So the priest was somewhere in this area. I can't tell you exactly where he would have been, where he would have resided. But then he walked down to the harbor, and here he was, the harbor of Paramesses, and he said, I'm at the harbor of Avaris. Technically speaking, the abandoned harbor of Avaris is right there. See that right there? That's where the harbor of Avaris was. But there were no ships there. There's no reason for him to be at the harbor of Avaris. So he undoubtedly would have been at this harbor. So that being the case, all of this site is Paramesses. All of this site is Avaris. It's one and the same. Even though, technically speaking, only this lower area is technically Avaris. Well, this being the case, and I think I need to pull you back for a moment to this final paragraph here. There's an article, a journal article, published by the Journal of Evangelical Theological Society in 2001, it's been a while now, by a master's seminary professor, Old Testament professor named Michael Grisanti. I know him, wonderful man. And in that article, he published on what he found as he was going through the Hebrew Bible, because he was teaching this every day in the seminary. And actually, that's where I ended up doing my seminary studies. So, in his study, he found that there were certain things written here and there, especially in the historical books, especially in the ones that have narrative sequences in them with chronological references and so forth. But he found that there were certain things that were written that didn't suit the time of the person who would have been the main author of that book. For example, he found that in the Pentateuch, in the first 5 books, when it talks about the site of Dan, that that's a certain site where the Israelites are and so forth and whatever. Well, none of that happened. It never became that city until much after the Israelites moved into the land and took over the land, and then eventually, not right away, but eventually worked their way to living in cities. At first, they just lived as semi-nomadic people, as wanderers, in tents instead. So how is it that Moses, who had to have written by 1406 because he died in that year, right before the Israelites entered into Canaan, how did he know all this about the city of Dan? There's no way he could have known this. So this is one of the pieces of evidence that Grisanti used to suggest, and I think he's 100% right, that we have this practice that goes on, not with the Greek New Testament, but with the Hebrew Bible that was written from, the 15th century BC all the way to the 5th century BC. That's 1,000 years in which it was written. So there was a dynamic that happened, and that was it was not, okay, when a certain writer was done writing a book, it wasn't necessarily required that that book not be added to at all by anyone among the Israelite scribes or those who were entrusted with the Hebrew Bible. So the bottom line is that there were changes, he's suggesting, that were made, and mainly we're talking about additions. Additions were made, and in some cases, like Dan, an insertion was made to clarify things for the readers of that later day in Israel's history. And at the end of the day, that's not a problem. It's in minute areas that there are places where there's fluidity, where you can add something, to this very day. The statement "to this very day," that's this kind of a statement that you find over and over and over in the Hebrew Bible. And that's because probably some scribe inserted that later as a parenthetical statement. So, and you can study his article. There's all kinds of pieces of evidence that I think will prove conclusively that this did happen. Whether we want it to have happened or not, it's not up to us. It's just a question of whether it did happen or not, and for us to understand it. It doesn't mean there's something wrong with inerrancy. It has nothing to do with undermining inerrancy. Not at all. It's just that the Hebrew Bible experienced something very different than the Greek New Testament, and we have to understand that. So that being the case, I argue, in agreement with him and his how many examples he has in his article, 10 or something examples, I suggest we add one more to that. And that is the term he uses is textual update. It's a textual update by a later scribe. And that suggestion I'm making is that there was an earlier name, or toponym is the word we would use, the name of the site where Jacob settled his family, that had a different name, and then later in time it was changed to Pi-Ramesses or Ramses. Why would this be the case? Because Āvāris was abandoned and not inhabited anymore, but over time, of course, when Ramses II settled at his site at Kantir and built a city there, that was a major hub. And as you go into the Israelite, the period of the judges and so forth, and that ancient name of the site that's no longer used, as it shows up here in Genesis 47:11 and in Exodus 1, the readers wouldn't understand where that site is. So the name of the site was updated to the current name of the city. It's the same deal with Leningrad and St. Petersburg, right? It's one and the same city, but if you're writing a book nowadays and you want young people to read it and understand it, and you're writing about the city that existed during the time of communism, you're not going to write Leningrad because they're not going to know that word from Adam. You write St. Petersburg, then they'll know what and where that city is. True? So that's the concept. You're not doing something terrible to the Bible to change it. You're doing something to make it accessible and understandable to your reader. That's a virtue. That's a positive, not a negative. So I suggest to you with great confidence that this is exactly what happened. So if this is true, what I'm suggesting to you, then it refutes the argument of the late Exodus people that say you can't have that site in the 15th century BC as where Jacob settled. It doesn't work. It works. It works because Āvāris is there. And it's one and the same with Pi-Ramesses. Okay, having said that, now we're going to zoom in on some things. There is so this is the area here, right in the middle of the screen of the shot here, where the Egyptians had a settlement at the time that the Israelites, Jacob and his family, moved down to Egypt, and they needed their own place to reside, their own part of town to inhabit. So the Egyptians were in this area. The Israelites, Jacob and his family, they lived in this area primarily, just to the southwest of that. So this is, well, I'll cover that in a minute. So as we zoom in on this, these two areas are known as Area R1, where the Egyptians were, and there was an important temple here. That's a temple to the founder of the 12th dynasty. So in the ancient world, whether you know this or not, oftentimes there was a cult of worship for a deceased, usually, and originally it was this way, for a deceased king. So later in the 12th dynasty, they revered the founder of the 12th dynasty, and they built temples to him and worshipped this dead ruler, which in their minds, of course, he's alive somewhere else, and so they're paying homage to him. So there's that temple there. It's really close to the water, you can see, of the Plusiac branches. It's heading to the northeast. So the Israelites are down here, and where you see black marks, this is where the excavators have been digging and doing work. There's an Austrian archaeological team that's still digging there. They've been digging there since, I think, the late 60s. For over 40 years, it was led by a man named Manfred Bietak. It's the most beautiful, the most amazing, the most well-excavated site in all of the ancient Near East. Part of the reason for that is because the Austrian government has been financing this excavation for decades. So they have really deep pockets, which is wonderful. Most of us archaeologists have, no pockets. So because of that, I'm able to share all of this with you today. Had that not been the case, there would be nothing to show. So they did a lot of work where the Israelites settled in this area in F1. This is just a schematic of the area, and it's too detailed and you're too far away, so I'm not going to get into it, but it just shows what parts of the site were occupied at certain times and what are the names that the archaeologists have assigned to it. I guess I'll just tell you this, that this column here is R1, that's where the Israelites were. This is area F1, that's where the Egyptians were. And, it's Bet Rushdie. This is where the Israelites were. This is F1, and this is R1, where the Egyptians were. So there's an important landmark or an artifact that was discovered that we're going to be talking about in a moment that relates to this area here, this time period here, which is stratum E1 and E2. But the Israelites, their first occupational phase is right here in what's called D2, lowercase d, / 2, and their second phase in D1. And I'll be trying to prove to you that D2 is when Jacob would have been settled at the site, and D1 is when his grandsons, Ephraim and Manasseh, were settled at the site. Okay, I'm going to skip a bit of the chronology, but I'll mention this. In 1878 BC, we have this transition between two pharaohs, Sesostris II and Sesostris III. Sesostris II dies in 1878, and at that point, the nation is turned over to his son, his successor, and again, I don't know if I'll have the time to prove it to you or not, but that very year of the transition marks the end of the 7 years of abundance and the beginning of the 7 years of famine, which makes Sesostris II what we can conveniently call the abundance pharaoh. Sesostris III we can call the famine pharaoh. The date that Jacob would have settled there is 1876 BC. We get that number because 1446 is the right year for the Exodus. If you look at Exodus chapter 12, verses 40 and 41, it says 430 years to the very day after the Israelites landed in Egypt, the Exodus occurred. So it's a real simple math equation. You go back 430 years from 1446, and it takes you to 1876. And from that peg, we're able to fill in some relative chronological events. such as when Jacob dies, like this, 1859. That's the year that Jacob dies. Oddly enough, that's the year that Sesostris II, the famine pharaoh, he invites his son, Amenemhat III, to take the throne with him. They become co-rulers. And as you might expect, and this was the case all the time you had co-rulers in ancient Egypt, the older pharaoh, usually the father, he would go off into semi-retirement. The son, and youth and ambition, right, and energy, they all go hand in hand. So his son would take over as the ruler, and so he was doing the practical ruling in the country every day. Okay? So conveniently, and I didn't plan it that way, conveniently, that's the year that Jacob dies, and there's this big transition for the Israelites who are there at the site. And then 1805 is the year that Joseph dies. So, Sesostris II, abundance pharaoh, Sesostris III, famine pharaoh, Amenemhat III, the pharaoh whose rule began in the year of Jacob's death. And as I told you from an earlier slide, D2 is the stratum or archaeological level as you're digging at a site, right? Each period has its own level, and that's what D2 is. That's the level where the Asiatics first settled there, and I'm suggesting to you these were Israelites. And I'm not even the first to suggest that, by the way. I'm about the third or fourth or fifth. So D2 is the first occupational level that the Asiatics are there, and I'm connecting that with Jacob himself. And in fact, even with the very house where I suggest to you he lived. D1 is the second Asiatic occupational level there. That's where Ephraim and Manasseh, when they would have taken over for their grandfather who is now gone. Okay, so that connects us. A secure date for the site is found. Remember I told you there was a certain artifact found in the Egyptian part of the city. Actually, it was found in that temple to Amenemhat I, the deceased ruler of the first ruler of the dynasty. And this is called the Esbet Rushdi Stela. This is really important. It says a lot of important things on it. For example, up here in the upper right in the yellow, this says renal year, and then these are four strokes, 5 strokes. That means 5 years, or year 5. So this is the year of the reign of the king in his 5th year. And his name is in green here, and this is Senwasret. It means Sesostris. And it doesn't say the third, but we know of him as the third. So, oddly enough, this is the famine pharaoh. And this stela dates to year 5 of his reign. And as I told you, the 7 years of abundance end when Sesostris II dies, and Sesostris III takes over. So he has a long reign. And 5 years into his reign is when this was inscribed. Now, how long does the famine last? 7 years. So is this during or after the famine? During. How far in? 5 out of the 7 years in. That's when it's written. 5 out of the 7 years. What do you expect would be the conditions 5 of the 7 years into the famine? Things are getting really much better? Worse. And eventually, what do the people have to do? Yeah, they sell all their property, and that's not enough, so what do they do then? They sell themselves to Pharaoh, right? So this is a slow process, It's a leaking faucet that just gives up the ghost. So this is at a time of great, if I'm right, with all the chronology, and I'm not even going into the details to establish the chronology and the right synchronism. I don't have time to do that. That's an hour to 2 hours, okay? But assuming I'm right, that's where we are at this point in biblical history. 5 years into the 7-year famine, when things are really getting bad. Oh, and I'll point this out to you as well. In case I don't see it later, or in case it doesn't register for me later. So on this stela, there are 2 hieroglyphs that are important for our purposes. One, this is an Asiatic person. It's a person from Retinue. That's what it is. It's a Levantine person, someone from the Levant. Southern Levant is Canaan. Northern Levant is Phoenicia and Syria. So that whole area, the northern and southern Levant, is what this hieroglyph is referring to. So the person that comes before it, this hieroglyph is telling us that this person, that's his name, and it's Horefhat. He is a Levantine person. He comes from the Levant. His family originates from the Levant. And then this hieroglyph here, this I affectionately refer to as the touchdown hieroglyph. This is a rarely used hieroglyph. It's used for a person, used of a person. It has two main meanings in Egyptian, not exclusive meanings, but main meanings. One is someone or something that's very tall. So it's high, H-I-G-H. The other main meaning is high in the sense of high in rank or high in position. A high person, someone high up the chain, really at or near the top. So usually in this position where this is a title and this is Heri Per, which is head of the household. That's a term that's most often in the ancient inscriptional evidence. It's used of the Pharaoh's house. And the head of the household would be someone who oversees the Pharaoh's house. Okay? And so, Heri Per, that's what it says here. And then usually right here would be a common, what's called a seated man hieroglyph. Do you see this one here? That's a seated man hieroglyph to the right of the Levantine man hieroglyph. That's what you'd expect here. This touchdown hieroglyph, that's really bizarre. It shouldn't be there, but it is. What it's telling you is that the head of the household is a really high up person. That's what it's telling you. Okay? That hieroglyph is communicating this in an odd way that doesn't appear in normal Egyptian writings, hieroglyphic writings. So this entire stela, it kind of breaks some conventions. But remember, it's located at the site where the Asiatics were in year 5 of the famine, when the Israelites are already there. Okay? So remember that as we go forward here. So a quick couple parts of this Esbet Rushdie stela. I won't read the whole thing. This is my translation. It's never been, the translation of this has never been published, the full translation, ever. So in my second book, in an appendix, this translation will appear. It'll be the first time it's published. But going down to the main point, right here. Now watch this. The digging of a dike for the temple estate of Amenemhat I, the justified, at the mouth of the path that is along the waters of this city, north of the temple. Do you remember our diagram before? We had that rectangular temple of Amenemhat I here, and above it was flowing the Nile River, the Plusiac branch of the Nile, right? And the river was what direction from the temple? North. And wouldn't you know it, that's exactly what it says in the inscription. So, what it's saying is that a dike had to be dug from the river, from the Plusiac branch of the Nile, down to the temple and the temple estate along this path. The length of the mouth of the path that was uprooted was 26 cubits, and in the ancient world, 26 royal cubits in Egypt is equal to 13.6 meters. How many yards is that for any of you mathematicians among us? I don't have the yards figure. That's what, 18 yards or something like that? 15, 18 yards? Somewhere in there. That's how long it is. So, what it's saying is that the path that was dug to create this dike, to bring water from the Plusiac branch of the Nile to the temple, it was 13.6 meters in distance. I'll bet you a nickel that if we go to that site and we find where that temple was and we pace off down to the riverfront, it's going to be around 13.6 meters or so. I'll bet you a nickel. Because that's the distance. Now, why would you build a dike from the river to the temple in this year, the 5th year of Sesostris III, and not before and, conceivably not after? Why? Well, if the water level was going down and down and down over time, and the priests at the temple needed water to be able to fulfill the responsibilities of the worship cult, you've got to get water to them, don't you? So the way to do it is to dig out a trench that will take you from where the bank of the river is all the way to the temple. That's exactly what happened here. So what could precipitate this? What do you think? What event would precipitate the digging of such a dike to bring water directly to the temple for the priests? A famine, a drought, exactly. The water level decreasing because of that famine. And it fits perfectly in biblical chronology. What do you know? Okay, now let's look at who was involved in this project of building the dike. And this is beautiful because it's a lesson for us today. It's a what's the word I want? I can't think of it. It's a combined effort between two groups who are foreign to each other. And here's what it says. The stela was sealed by the hand. So when you put a seal on something, it's like you have a signet ring, right? And you have a clump of clay. You roll up. You write a document on a papyrus. You roll it up. You put a clump of clay on, and then you stamp, or maybe you have it hanging around your neck. You stamp it with your seal, and that seal on it shows that it's from you. And if it remains unopened, then the recipient who's supposed to read it knows nobody else interfered if it's a clean clump of clay that hasn't been broken, right? So that's the idea. Now, you saw that this is a piece of stone, this stela. I think you saw the black and white, right? It's stone. So you can't use a normal, piece of stone to make an impression in stone, can you? So it has to be etched in. It has to be inscribed. Which means that this Sem priest, that's an Egyptian priest named Ep, he, if you will, signed the document. He signed the agreement for this mutual work of labor to be accomplished. He signed, and then someone else signed. The overseer of the administrative division of foreign land. And this is it. Horus is in his son, the Levantine. This is when I showed you that Levantine man hieroglyph. This is the guy. So this is a foreigner. So you have an Egyptian and an Asiatic coming together, and both of them are sealing this stone stela. And I'll bet you another nickel. I'm going to get rich tonight, folks. Bet you another nickel if you and I were to go to Egypt and find that stela, assuming it's still around, and you never know with museums, but assuming it's there, if you and I were to go to that museum and look at the stone and inspect it, up and down, top to bottom, front to back, everywhere, sides, everywhere, I bet you a nickel we would find 2 seals. One of an Egyptian priest and one of this overseer of the administration of foreign lands. Well, who is he? Who is this Asiatic man? Well, look at his name. Horus is in his son. Horus is, oh boy, who moved the clock? It cannot be 25 after 8. Horus at this time was the king of the gods. He's represented in Egyptian iconography as, anybody know the animal? Horus? Falcon. Very good. Yes, excellent. It's the falcon god. So he's the king of the gods. So, and in the ancient world, we were talking about this outside the room right before we began. In the ancient world, you didn't get a name at birth. That's inconceivable. It's silly. And the longer I live, the more I realize this is probably true. It's probably silly. In the ancient world, you received a name when something distinguishes you. And then that name sticks with you. because everybody remembers that distinguishing quality or moment or act that you did, or something stupid, something great, whatever it was, you could be named that thing, right? So be careful what you do in the ancient world, or that will be your name. That being the case, the King of the gods is in his Son. That's his name. When in life do you think someone can receive the name, the King of the gods is in my Son? When I'm born? No. When I'm 15? 50% chance here, yes or no? No takers? No. When I'm 25, 30? Maybe, but probably not, right? Why? Why probably not? Because something would have to happen, not in your life, in your son's life, to distinguish him as someone of whom others would say, wow, the King of the gods is in him. Which means your son's probably not a little kid, probably not a teenager, probably not a 20-year-old. Probably he's old enough to do something and to do a lot of things that show people, whoa, everything he does, the King of the gods is in him. That's who this person is. You know who this fits perfectly? Jacob. Because what's true of Joseph? What happens when Pharaoh has the dream and nobody can interpret it, none of his wise men or his seers, and Joseph's brought in, and the king is about to tell the dream to Joseph? What is Joseph's response? Does anybody know?
Well, he explains that God is the interpreter.
Right. He says, it is not in me, but God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Isn't that beautiful?
Yes.
Here's a guy who's stuck in prison. Joseph. For years he's in prison, unfairly. He's sitting there rotting away, humanly speaking. He's dragged out of prison. He's given an opportunity to be back in the real world and to do something, not just for anyone, but for the king of all of Egypt. This was his moment to take all the credit. I suggest to you, he knew he was going to be interpreting this dream. He knew. But he took zero credit for it. It's not in me. I can't do it. But God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. He knew God was going to be speaking through his mind and his mouth to communicate the meaning of that dream to Pharaoh. That's Joseph. You know what that tells me? That's somebody of whom we can say, the King of the gods is in that man. You agree?
Yes.
Every opportunity he had, he put God first. Every opportunity he had. The King of the gods is in that man. This could be Jacob, the one who sealed the stela together with the Egyptian sem-priest. Okay, onward. And somebody needs to stop that clock from moving, I tell you. So it continues. The workmanship is of my hand. Head of the household. So now this is talking about either the workmanship of one or two things, of one or two things. It's either the workmanship of the dike, the building of the dike, but that would mean that this high up person is doing all the physical labor. That doesn't seem to make sense. It's possible, but not that plausible. The other option is this could be meaning it's his workmanship that crafts this stela. He writes it. He writes it. He writes this stela, and he has two people sign it. Probably the lead priest from that temple and the person, the Asiatic who lives there, who's in charge of that area. And if, sure enough, we're 5 years into the famine, 3 years after Jacob moves there, Jacob would be in charge. He doesn't die till 1859. He's there 17 years. This is only 3 years after he's arrived. He would be in charge, wouldn't he? So he would be the one to sign this. So the workmanship is of my hand, probably talking about the person who inscribes the Middle Egyptian hieroglyphic stela. And then it gives his title and then his name. Head of the household, remember that? Head of the household, high one in a hieroglyph that shouldn't be there. That's the guy who inscribes this. And then it gives his name, and it's always an Egyptian title, then name. The name is son of Sobek. This is beautiful, son of Sobek. And again, he probably doesn't take this name on his own. He's probably given this name by others. Son of Sobek. Sobek is represented by, anybody know the animal that fits together with this god? You might find some in a swamp somewhere. Yeah, it's a gator. Or a croc, whatever. It's the alligator god, Sobek. The alligator god's primary connection to the Egyptian people is they viewed the alligator god, the god Sobek, as the god who provided for the people of Egypt through the life-giving waters of the Nile River. That's what he did. Now, again, if I had the full 8 hours with you, I would prove to you that Joseph moved first after he was elevated to Lahoun. And what he did at Lahoun is he redirected the flow of an offshoot of the Nile River called the Bar Yusuf. He redirected its waters to the west, so for you, this way, into a valley called the Fayum. You can look at it on a map today. You can Google this and look at and check it out. He redirected water in such a way that it was a controlled flow of water for the purposes of irrigation. That Fayum, every Egyptologist who knows the 12th dynasty, and we're in the 12th dynasty here, will tell you that the first time in ancient history when the Fayum was exploited as what's called the breadbasket of Egypt, the first time that happened is during the reign of Sesostris II. Who, ladies and gentlemen, remembers who Sesostris II is? The abundance pharaoh. Oh, really? And what happened is, remember this word from the inscription? 5 years in to the famine? The dike. Somebody decided to build a dike to take those waters from the Bar Yusuf into the Fayum to create this irrigated system that's going to grow grain out the wazoo. Somebody did that. Somebody devised that. If it was Joseph, then don't you think the Egyptians would look at him and say, wow, this brilliant guy devised the plan to bring water in a controlled way into this area and create this cultivatable land, and now we're making grain like, Henry Ford makes Model Ts. It's one of those deals. And wouldn't you think they would look at him and say, wow, the God who provides for Egypt through the life-giving waters of the Nile is in that man. Don't you think they would say that of him? Except that he's the son of that God. That's what he's called. He is the son of the God who provides for Egypt through the life-giving waters of the Nile River. That's who this person is. Then it says this. Then it gives another title and another name, right? Another title and another name. And this is very odd for you to have at the end of a stela like this, an inscription. Title name, after the workmanship is of my hand. There's nothing else to say to show in there in this stela, to show that the second person has some kind of differentiation, that he's not the same as the head of the household, son of Sobek. So, that being the case, probably these are two names for the same man, because it doesn't tell us anything else to distinguish this man as having done. So, if that's the case, then he's also called the controller of this city. The controller of the city means basically he is in charge of this entire city. Now, if Joseph had been elevated to second in command in all of Egypt, and everything in the land is under his control except, whatever Pharaoh claims for himself, don't you think Joseph would be the controller of that city? I think so. And then it gives a name. Horus is at the forefront, Jr. Horus is at the forefront, Jr., which, by the way, is related to this person. Horus is in his son. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, Horus is at the forefront, Jr., and then it says that he's the son of Horus is at the forefront, Senior. So I suggest to you that Horus is at the forefront, Senior is the same as Horus is in his son up here. And so that's the father, and this is the son, and that this is Joseph. Horus, king of the gods, is at the forefront. And again, that's what I was getting at. So you have son of Sobek, and you have the king of the gods is at the forefront. That's Joseph, always putting God in the position of primacy, not himself. So if I'm right, then this stela was written, inscribed, 5 years into the famine, when things were getting really bad, when the Egyptians and the Israelites and the Hebrews, the sons of Jacob, came together to build this dike to help supply water for the priests who were there. Okay, so the identity of Sasobek and Horamchat Jr., who is he? So we already talked about this, and I'm going to skip that and take you to this site. Okay, first of all, remember this, that we have year 5 of Sesostris III, the famine pharaoh, 5 years into the famine. We have this guy who's the craftsman who, it's at his hand that this is made, and he's the controller of the city. So his title is head of the household, and then we have that touchdown hieroglyph. Remember that. Well, all of this took place at this site in Egypt in the Nile Delta called Avaris, but there's something else that's connected way down here in Sinai. There are 2 sites here, kind of like sister sites, where the Egyptians, throughout their history at various times, would send mining expeditions to extract turquoise. It became a lucrative industry for them. That's one of the ways they got rich, to be honest. And so during Joseph's lifetime, they also sent, this is a period of great wealth and prosperity during the reign of Sesostris III, especially in Egypt's history. So they would send teams down there to extract this turquoise to be able to trade and make lots of money, if you will, and become rich. So these 2 sites, sister sites, one of them is Maghara, that's the earlier site of the 2, and then the later one is Serebit el-Khadim. Some of the inscriptions translated in my book that if we get time next week to talk about, they are from Serebit el-Khadim. These are Hebrew inscriptions, but of Moses' day, not of Joseph's day, where they returned to the mines to do work, but later as slaves in Moses' day. Anyway, Maghara is the site first occupied. This featured 3 mining camps in antiquity, and it was mined during Dynasty 12, that is the lifetime of Joseph and his children. Well, if you go to one of these, they're 8 to 9 foot high stelae that are made of stone, and they're carved on one side, carved on the other side, and they're carved on the thin actual sides. And on one of the larger faces, this is inscribed, and we have touchdown hieroglyph for a row that goes from right to left, touchdown hieroglyph starting this row that goes from right to left, and starting in this row that goes from right to left. Now, the bottom line is, these are called determinatives, this touchdown hieroglyph. You never start a word with it. You only end a word with it. That's how it goes in Egyptian hieroglyphics. No exceptions. That being the case, this is horrible Egyptian. Down here in the turquoise mines, way down in Sinai. When does it happen? Year 2 of Amenemhat III. Year 2 of Amenemhat III is 1 year after Jacob dies. Now, I used to think that when you read about the tribes of Jacob, and they're all listed and whatnot, that that all of this is, at the time of Jacob, it's just a plaque on a wall. It's just a forethought about these tribes and what they'll have and all of this and who they are. And I used to think that the encounter that Jacob had with his grandsons, when Jacob was about to die, Joseph went to visit him. He took his two eldest sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And these events that happened while they were together, and the receiving of this birthright that Ephraim gets, and this great blessing that Ephraim and Manasseh get from Jacob, I used to think that this is like a plaque on the wall for future use, way down hundreds of years later when they'll have full tribes and they'll take over. And that's not the case at all. Instead, now that I've seen the archaeological evidence, I know that when Joseph's sons were brought in front of Jacob, and Jacob says to Joseph, as for the rest of your children, they're yours, but these two are mine. That's not a plaque on the wall. He was physically stealing them away from Joseph. That's what he was doing. Stealing them away. Why? It was a stroke of genius. Because he was about to die. He knew that his sons and their children were just, Asiatics. They're living in Canaan. They're not Egyptian. They don't know how to survive in Egypt. They don't know how to get by. They don't know the language. They don't know the culture. They don't know the religion. They don't know virtually anything about life in Egypt. So when Jacob's about to die, Joseph comes to visit, and Joseph brings his two eldest sons there. If not sooner, Jacob looked at those two sons and he saw dollar signs, if you will. But not for money, for what it could be for his sons and their children. All of the other sons of Jacob and their families. Because they would need to be able to survive in this place. Because they were out of home, away from home. They were in a foreign land. And they needed help. But Ephraim and Manasseh were born and raised in Egypt, under the second in command in all of Egypt, with a mother whose lineage includes a father who is a priest in the city of On, which is Heliopolis, one of the chief cities for religion in ancient Egypt. So he knows all about Egyptian culture. He undoubtedly knows Egyptian writing. Ephraim and Manasseh undoubtedly know Egyptian writing. They know the language. They know the culture. They know how commodities work there. They know everything about the culture. So Jacob says, I'm taking them to live here in my stead for when I die. So Jacob dies. They take him on a trip to Canaan, bury him. Everybody returns. And guess what? Ephraim and Manasseh don't go home with Joseph. They stay. And that happens in year 1 of Amenemhat III. Then, in the first year after that, year 2 of Amenemhat III, the very next year, we have these strange touchdown hieroglyphs, just like we saw on the Ezbet Rushdi stela from year 5 of the famine pharaoh. Which means, and this is written for sure by an Asiatic, which means whatever Asiatic went down there the year after Jacob died and was part of this expedition, knew the strange touchdown hieroglyph used on the Ezbet Rushdi stela and used it in another strange way to begin a narrative on 3 different lines. Then, and you can't see it, it's off the screen, this is year 6, so 4 years later. 4 years later, in year 6 of Amenemhat III, is this inscription. Same deal, but vertical. Touchdown hieroglyph, touchdown, 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 touchdown. Big score, right? Lots of touchdowns. It's not supposed to start a line this way. Then this inscription. And this is year 13 of Amenemhat III. This is what? 7 years after that? Yeah, this is 7 years after that. Here we have touchdown, touchdown, touchdown. But now look at this. Hairy pear. Hairy pear. Whoa, this is really weird. And this is the way that it's written in the Proto-Consonantal language. That's a Hebrew letter right there, folks. That is a Hebrew way of writing the house. The house is supposed to be written like this, with a doorway. And it's actually not supposed to be square like that. It's supposed to be rectangular. So whoever's writing, whoever crazy Asiatic, the crazy Asiatic is who's writing all of this, is hacking up the way you're supposed to write hieroglyphs. But that doesn't matter, does it? They're not writing for a pharaoh. They're not writing for a temple. So you have head of the household, someone who's high up. Head of the household, someone who's high up. Head of the household, someone who's high up. This is somebody who knows the Ezbet Rushdie Stela upside down and is writing the same thing. And what this is telling me is that you have people who are called head of the households with the touchdown hieroglyph. So what that means is, whoever the head of the household is, he's like this person at the top of the umbrella. And then under him, he's got this large group of people. Some of them are coming down to be part of this mining expedition. They're all under the umbrella of the head of the household, which makes perfect sense if that's Joseph, who's the head of the household. Does that make sense? And this gives us the connection and it's Manasseh. We'll talk about it next Tuesday. But this shows that it's Manasseh who is the one who's writing all of this, because that's the letter that he writes on an inscription that we'll take a look at. That's in my book. Okay. Okay, let's finish with this. Right here, we'll finish with this. Who is Sasobek? Remember I told you that that on the Ezbet Rushdie Stela, at the bottom, the person who under his craftsmanship, that this was made, probably it's the stela, and he's the controller of the city. One of his names is Sasobek, the son of the God who provides for Egypt through the life-giving waters of the Nile. That name, right? Who is this guy in Egyptian records? Well, if you go to the administrative seals, and remember I was talking about seals? You can have a seal. So you look at the different seals. A number of seals mention this guy from the 12th dynasty, and they tell us things about him. So on seal 1331, it says that Sasobek is called Iri Wepet, which means he who is where? At the top. On seal 1340, it reads, Chati en Chefet Cher, vizier who is in the front, Sasobek. Now he's called this word, Chati. He's called a vizier. Vizier is the Egyptian word for second in command in all of Egypt. Before I stumbled into all of this evidence, I refused to call Joseph a vizier, even though I knew vizier meant second in command in Egyptian. I refused until I saw in the record itself that the Egyptians called him a vizier. Here it is. Vizier who is at the front, Sasobek. Seal 1335. The king's wise man. What was Joseph to Pharaoh? He was the wise man, right? Jacob, the king, went to all the other wise men of Egypt to try to have them interpret the dream. None of them could. Who could? Joseph alone. Here, Sasobek is called the king's wise man. Doesn't that fit perfectly if that's Joseph? Then, and it also reads, the Lord, the revered, may he live again. And then finally, seal 1332. Sasobek is called great controller of the city. Great controller of the city. That probably doesn't mean Avaris. It probably means the capital city. The capital at this time was why all of a sudden is it escaping me? Anyway, I'll think of it for Tuesday. So the capital city, it means Caesar of the two lands. That's what it means. Someone who seizes the two lands. The two lands is Egypt. Northern Egypt is Lower Egypt. Southern Egypt is Upper Egypt. So the Caesar of two lands, that's the name of the city. That's the capital city. Ich Tawi, that's what it is. It's called Ich Tawi. That is what's being referred to here. This guy, Sasobek, is the great controller of the city, which means he controls the capital city for the Pharaoh. He's clearly second in command. And it means he's in charge, essentially, of all the cities. So that fits Joseph perfectly. Sasobek, the son of the God who provides for Egypt through the life-giving waters of the Nile. All right, let's pray, and then we'll pick this up next time together. Father, thank you for the opportunity to look into the annals of history, as it were, ancient Egypt, as it connects us to the lifetime and the characters of the Bible. What an amazing thing that so many important things have survived until today. And that means you purposefully preserved them, and you purposefully chose our era to make them known, and you purposely raised me up to make this known to people. Why? Because you are the one who provided for Egypt and for the Israelites with great power to preserve them during the time of the famine that should have taken their lives. And with that, you made Egypt great. And with that, you provided for your people Israel for 430 years, living in a land as foreigners. This amazing story shows us the power, the truthfulness, the veracity, the trustworthiness of the Word of God. I pray, Lord, that as a result of our exposure to this, that our view of you would increase, our awe of you would grow, that we would be more and more amazed at what you did, because now we see how it worked. You are awesome. Thank you for who you are. Thank you that even as having been the God who provided for the Egyptians and for the Israelites during that time in ancient history, you provide for us today. There's nothing that we have that you have not provided. There's nothing we need, truly need, that you won't provide. You want us to recognize you as the one who provides for all of us through the life-giving nourishment of the Word of God, through the Spirit of God who lives in each one of us. Thank you for His presence, for His power. May He use us in great ways in the lives of people, both today and tomorrow and in the days ahead. For the glory of Jesus, your Son, we pray. Amen.